Welcome to Inside the Castle, the podcast that goes behind castle doors to have real conversations with real people about solving the nation's toughest challenges. I'm one of your hosts today, Aaron Snyder.
And I'm Angie Fryermuth.
In this episode, we're going to talk about the National Hurricane Program. With us today are Marco Ciarla and Tom Laczo to discuss this important program. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
So before we get into it and start talking about what the National Hurricane Program is, could you both tell us about yourself and your role with USACE? Marco, let's start with you.
Sure. So I am a co-National Hurricane Program Manager alongside Tom Laczo, who will introduce himself in a second here. I'm also a member of the Public Involvement Specialist Cadre in the Corps, which is involved in collaboration, expertise, and facilitation support for projects throughout the Corps. Prior to my role with the National Hurricane Program, I was a project manager, mainly managing flood studies, smaller flood studies in the Baltimore district area of responsibility.
All right. My name is Tom Laczo. As you know, along with Marco Ciarla, I'm a National Hurricane Program Manager. I work out of the Baltimore district for the Corps of Engineers. I've been going on 15 years of service with the Corps, and I guess the first 7 years or so, I was with our engineering division as a coastal engineer. And then I moved to our planning division and now work as a National Hurricane Program Manager. And I've been a National Hurricane Program Manager since 2017.
Well, thank you both for being here today. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the National Hurricane Program?
Sure. So the National Hurricane Program is composed primarily of 3 large agencies: FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, and NOAA's National Hurricane Center, well, NOAA, and precisely through their National Hurricane Center. We provide technical assistance to different states, localities, tribal and territorial areas, to any of our other federal partners who request our assistance. So we focus on evacuation and response. For the Corps especially, we really look at the pre-hurricane season planning and operation decision-making support. And when a hurricane actually occurs, then we move into crisis management and crisis planning for those states and localities and territories in the United States that are threatened by those hurricanes. Our 3 big goals are to provide resources and technology, technical assistance to support hurricane evacuation and response planning, deliver comprehensive hurricane preparedness training and emergency to our emergency managers and partners, and lastly, really to provide operational tools such as our HURREVAC tool, which is hurricane evacuation. That's what HURREVAC stands for, and that is something that we, with our consultant, our primary duty is the operation and maintenance of that program, which our emergency managers utilize to support their hurricane evacuation response and decision-making during and before hurricanes.
I also wanted to mention that the Army Corps of Engineers National Hurricane Program is managed out of the Planning Center of Expertise for Coastal Storm Risk Management out of North Atlantic Division. The program office is out of Baltimore Division. That's where we sit. But just wanted to also call that out.
In listening to your response here, talking about evacuation response, the operational tools, I assume that this program is different than, like, say, the Corps' response for blue roofs and like debris cleanup and emergency power. How are they linked or connected? Just to clarify that for our audience.
So yeah, so obviously during whether it's a fire or a hurricane or even an earthquake, the Corps obviously has a operational side that goes in usually after the fact and helps clean up. I know the Baltimore district, one of our specialties is debris cleanup. Marco and I have a colleague who went to Puerto Rico to do blue roofs after a hurricane. That is a different side of what the Corps does versus what the National Hurricane Program is. The National Hurricane Program really emphasizes the portion way before a hurricane ever threatens land. It's like all the planning that goes into it. We conduct hurricane evacuation studies for each state that is a coastal state, and you go through this process, you see what all your hazards are, what in that state is vulnerable to a hurricane. We look at people's behaviors, how they would potentially respond to an evacuation declaration. We look at where people could shelter. In addition to the final product is, how long does it take X amount of people in a given state that are going to be threatened with storm surge to evacuate those areas. So we get what we call a clearance time, and that's one of the big takeaways from these hurricane evacuation studies. And that clearance time, along with all those other things like the hazards and what the vulnerabilities are placed into HURREVAC. So that's the planning side. And then as we get into hurricane season, that software that we work with, the hurricane evacuation software, we can have our partners and our emergency managers in the different states utilize that program to track the hurricane, figure out who's at risk and what areas would potentially need to be evacuated based on the National Hurricane Center's forecasts, which are also part of HURREVAC. We can determine, when they need to call an evacuation based on that hurricane's trajectory and track, along with how long our hurricane evacuation studies said it takes them to evacuate that given area. So that's how HURREVAC is used during the event. That's really how the Corps operates with our planning phase versus the operational side. We also have post-hurricane analysis that we would like to do. This is something that we have in the recent past have struggled with doing based on funding, but it's something we continue to try to do. And basically it allows us to go into areas that were affected by hurricanes, see how our hurricane evacuation study was utilized and how it could be improved in the future, and obviously how those forecasts of the hurricane's landfall and potential inundation areas compare to facts on the ground. The part that you were talking about is the last part, the recovery portion, is something the Corps is definitely involved with, but it is not, as of now, linked directly to the National Hurricane Program. We pretty much stop with those, if we're able to do them, those analyses of how the hurricane actual on the ground facts compare to our hurricane evacuation studies and the forecast that we utilize in HURREVAC.
Yes, it does. So thank you for that. Earlier, you talked about partnerships with other federal agencies and how it's a joint program. So can you talk about these partnerships, and specifically, do you feel like the partnerships have been strengthened due to the establishment of this program?
Absolutely. Strong partnerships are really at the foundation of the National Hurricane Program. Because of that, we're able to produce the best information to the stakeholders so that they can make the most informed decisions during and before storm. So the National Hurricane Center, as Tom mentioned, provides the products that people see on the weather stations. Then we combine those products with the hurricane evacuation studies that are primarily led by the Army Corps and FEMA, of course, with help from the National Hurricane Center. And when we combine those products together, they really provide a lot of great information for these emergency managers to make the most informed decisions. So a strong partnership between these three agencies is critical in order for our program to function properly. Collaboration is, again, at the heart of this partnership. Ultimately, we don't just build these partnerships within the three agencies. We also extend out to other agencies. We work very closely with the Weather Prediction Center. We work very closely with USGS as well, and NGOs like the American Red Cross. All these partnerships are critical because once we get to the states, the locals, the tribes, the territories, they need to know and they need to feel confident that the information that they're getting is the best information possible. The only way to do that is to have a clear understanding of which information should be used and who's providing it. So that's really, I think, one of the strengths of this program, and which makes it very unique, is that we have very strong partnerships amongst these three very large agencies to meet this common goal.
Yeah, I think it's really impressive being able to synchronize and coordinate with obviously three large agencies, and then also being able to prepare for these types of significant disasters and emergencies that arise. So it seems like our involvement in this program has probably provided a tremendous amount of value, but kind of curious, what resources do we bring to bear specifically for this group? And how do we specifically assist these other agencies to create the whole of government response?
So I guess I'll take that. So basically, with the hurricane program, I guess one of our primary tasks, along as a core employee, we do a lot of training. So actually, Marco and I just did training last week at a national hurricane conference where we worked with our fellow agencies, FEMA, National Hurricane Center, NOAA, along with all the different states' emergency managers. I would say our first way in which we really help other federal, state, and state agencies is understanding how to utilize HURREVAC, our program, for the best, the biggest bang for the buck, understand what it can do for them as far as pulling information from the forecast center, looking at where their states potentially have vulnerabilities. It is our hope that like our transportation analysis, which is part of the hurricane evacuation studies, is utilized to not just understand what their clearance time is, but potentially as those states develop and more people move towards the coast, how they could create better road networks, whether it's increasing the size of a given highway or potentially planning new roads, and where those we can see in the hurricane transportation analysis where there are bottlenecks and potentially, improve those intersections, on and off ramps. The program can actually be used all the way down to, infrastructure, how we develop infrastructure for the country and those given states. Again, the big component that the Corps brings is we do a lot of the contracting work, and we are really in charge of the operations and maintenance of that program, HURREVAC, which is kind of like a keystone piece of the National Hurricane Program. In addition to that, we operate and we conduct all of the hurricane evacuation studies throughout the country for the National Hurricane Program. So we have district study leaders in each one of our core districts that are on the coastal, that are in the coastal states, from Maine to Texas, Hawaii, and there's obviously the districts also work with the different U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico. We work with those states to conduct the hurricane evacuation studies, which is, again, the second large component that the Corps performs as part of the program. Again, it's to understand the state's hazards, vulnerabilities, where their shelters are, how people could potentially behave during the hurricane, and obviously the big piece, the transportation analysis. So I would say the Corps component of the National Hurricane Program and how we really help move along the program as a whole are conducting hurricane evacuation studies and also updating and refining the HURREVAC program with our consultant and making sure that that program can work from the planning stage throughout the evolution of a hurricane during points where that hurricane could impact people's lives.
I think you covered most of the stuff we do. Also, just want to emphasize, and tying back to your previous question about partnerships and the importance of those partnerships, I think ultimately what it comes down to is that there's a ton of great information out there, and I think the agencies provide a ton of great data that can be used by these stakeholders. But, like a lot of things nowadays, there's information overload, right? So I think at the core of what we do is, yes, we develop these products, but then, Tom mentioned training, understanding from the stakeholders, like, how are you going to use these products and how can we assist you in essentially combing through all this data and figuring out how it can best be used to inform your decisions. So we do the training, but we also coordinate big annual meeting every year with the states and ensure that they're updated on the latest and greatest information that we have to provide. And then we receive feedback from them on where they want the direction of the program to kind of start heading and what they need from us. They ultimately go and talk to the locals, and they will talk with the locals and not only disseminate that information, but also acquire more feedback so that they can put it up to us. The locals also go to us directly, during these HURREVAC trainings. So again, it's just really making sure that you have all this information, but here is kind of maybe the best way that you can use it, or a recommended way that you may be able to integrate it within your own planning. Because again, ultimately, we need to build those strong relationships. They need to trust that we have that information for them, but then we also need to help them kind of sift through all the data and figure out, which information is most critical to them so that they can act upon it.
So thank you for that. With any program, there are tons of challenges and opportunities, and I know that this is not any unique program, so I'm sure that there's some challenges and opportunities that you have encountered as you've worked through the National Hurricane Program. So Marco, can you talk about those?
Absolutely. So like any program, especially national programs, funding is always something that program managers have to deal with. Actually, the National Hurricane Program has a fairly small budget. The FEMA budget is around 2.4 million a year. We bring some internal funds to the process as well, and so does the National Hurricane Center. But overall, this program really brings a lot of bang for the buck, because in the grand scheme of things, for being a national program that deals with natural disasters, it's a very, very small program. And so we have to be very judicious with how we leverage those funds. It's a challenge just to be able to do all the work that we do within those limitations, but we do it well. And, in terms of finding new opportunities, that's something that Tom and I are constantly looking for, whether it be a funding opportunity or just really ways to just improve our products. So again, they could be the most useful. And I'll give you an example of that. Right now, there's a massive push at the federal and state and local level to integrate those EJ communities, the environmental justice communities, underserved populations. And so we are also moving to better integrate those disadvantaged communities within our hurricane evacuation studies. We work directly with the Engineering Research and Development Center within the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're currently looking into how we can identify those vulnerabilities from hurricane threats for those communities, but also what sort of impact those communities might have on an evacuation, whether it be response to an evacuation, so the behavioral side of it, I should say response to the evacuation orders, but also how does it impact the traffic patterns, or what modes of transportation are those individuals using, and what does that look like in the transportation model and the clearance times. So that's certainly an area of opportunity that we're exploring. Other areas of opportunities that we're exploring is how to better visualize the data. Historically, we've had these very large reports, as many Army Corps reports end up being. We don't want these reports to end up being door stoppers, right? We want them to be used, but more importantly, we want the most important data to be pulled out of those reports so that the emergency managers can use it for their own needs. Maybe they have an access database that they're populating with the information that we provide. Maybe they're using it in their operational timelines. And so by extracting that information from the stakeholders in all our trainings and coordination meetings and so forth, we're able to better hone in on how does this information be better communicated and displayed, so that they're not digging through 300-page technical report for that critical information. We're looking at ArcGIS Online databases. We're looking to see if we can integrate that information better in HURREVAC. That's the way things are moving, and we're trying to also be modern as a program. And again, with a small budget, it's not so easy, but again, I think we've done a very good job of that over the last 20+ years.
Thanks, Marco. And thanks for talking with us about this exciting program. I'm kind of curious, if Corps employees want to get involved in the program, is there someone they should reach out to, or how can they support?
Thanks so much for asking that question. We're always looking for extra helping hands. Right now, we have 19 district study managers throughout the Corps that support the program. So just a big shout out to them, because they are making this thing run smoothly. If you do want to be involved in the program and you are in the Corps, feel free to reach out to Marco Ciarla or Thomas Laczo. You can just look us up in the global. For others who are listening to this podcast that are interested to learn more about the hurricane program, you can visit FEMA.gov/emergency managers-management/risk-management/hurricanes. That's a mouthful. I'm hoping you guys can put it in the podcast notes. And of course, if you're an emergency manager, HURREVAC.com, HURREVAC.com. It also has a lot of our informational materials on there. You can find a fact book, you can find trainings, videos, YouTube videos, webinar recordings on how to better leverage HURREVAC for your internal uses. So those are the primary communication channels. Feel free to reach out. Like I said, we're always looking for helping hands.
Thanks, Marco. And we'll be sure to get those in the podcast notes for our listeners. And thank you, Marco and Tom, for joining us today for this edition of Inside the Castle. We appreciate you and your insights. To our listeners, we want to hear from you. What topics are important to you and people you're interested in hearing from. Until next time, be safe, be innovative, and be revolutionary. All right, that's a wrap.
Thanks for joining us for this Inside the Castle podcast. To provide your feedback, email us at cw.infrastructure.team@usace.army.mil. Stay tuned for additional Inside the Castle podcasts as we explore life inside the Corps and revolutionize civil works together.